Part 2. The link to the first part is in the description of this video. Enjoy watching. Mac wasn't sure what he was looking for but hoped to gain some insight into Carter Harrison's strange behavior. As he walked down the corridor toward Bill's cubicle, he was surprised to see Carter Harrison coming in the opposite direction. Remembering his last encounter, Father Mac tensed as Carter approached. Carter merely said, "When you're done with your meeting, Father Mac, please come see me in my office. I have something to share with you." Reluctantly, Father Mac agreed, though he would have preferred if Carter didn't know he was in the building. Now he felt unable to discuss the situation with Bill for fear of causing trouble for the staffer. Frustrated, he had a brief discussion with Bill about the homeless problem and then reluctantly made his way to Harrison's office. When he arrived, Harrison waved him in and closed the door behind him. As Harrison sat behind his desk in a high-backed executive chair, Father Mac noticed that the desk was elevated on a platform, making any visitor look up to Harrison. Father Mac mentally shook his head at the obvious ploy but said nothing. Harrison sat there, looking smugly at the priest. Father Mac remained silent until Harrison spoke up. "I know we're not in your office, Father Mac, but I couldn't miss the chance to make one last confession." Father Mac looked at him sharply. "Carter, I told you before that I don't want to hear your confession if you're not sincere. But this is different." Harrison said with a smirk, "I haven't committed this sin yet. I just wanted to confess that I'm going to do so this weekend. My partner and I are going to the beach together, and we will definitely engage in all sorts of illicit behavior. I thought I should confess now so I won't trouble you later." Father Mac stood up angrily. "Let me be as clear as possible. I will pray for your salvation, but I cannot serve as your confessor any longer. You're making a mockery of a sacred rite, and I won't be a part of it." With that, he turned and walked out of Harrison's office. His last view of Harrison was of the man laughing behind his desk as he walked out the door. Father Mac struggled to control his temper. The man was impossible. He had no desire to confess his sins, he wanted to boast about them. But why would he do that? Mac wondered if Harrison might have a mental illness. On Saturday morning, Colleen seemed anxious to start her weekend getaway. Mac broke away from his regular Saturday routine to see her off. He noticed she seemed preoccupied but attributed that to her eagerness to see her sister. Nevertheless, he made a special effort to connect with her before she left. "Drive carefully, babe," he urged, then hugged her and added, "I miss you when you're not here." She hugged him back perfunctorily and then hurried to get behind the wheel. As she started the engine, he called out, "I love you, Colleen," but she was already backing out of the driveway and didn't hear him. Mac returned inside feeling vaguely unsettled. Although he wasn't sure why, his unease grew. Then an insidious thought struck him. Harrison said he was taking his partner to the beach. He tried to dismiss the suspicion as soon as it came to mind, telling himself it was just a coincidence, lots of people go to the beach. Colleen would never cheat on him, and certainly not with someone like Carter Harrison. Harrison's weird behavior must have gotten to him, making him neurotic. But once the idea took hold, it kept eating away at him. He found himself unable to concentrate on his Sunday sermon. No matter how hard he tried to push the doubt away, it wouldn't leave him alone. Finally, he put down his sermon and reached for his phone to call Megan, hoping to settle his fears. He hesitated, unsure what to say. "What am I going to ask? Are you going to the beach with Carter Harrison? If she denies it, can I believe her? She's hardly likely to just admit it, and what if it's not true? Then she'll know I don't trust her, and that could cause a major rift between us." As he sat there wavering, another thought occurred to him. What if Megan knows and is covering for her? He set his phone down, his anxiety raging out of control. Desperate, he came up with a flimsy excuse for calling and dialed his sister-in-law's number. Megan picked up almost immediately. "Hi, Ma," she answered pleasantly. "Long time no talk," Megan said pleasantly, but a note of apprehension entered her voice. You're not calling about Colleen, are you? She's okay, isn't she? No, she's fine, Max said hastily, feeling ashamed for unnecessarily alarming her. It's just that you haven't been down to see us in a long time. I wish you'd plan a visit. Megan audibly relaxed. I know you're right, Mac. I've been so busy lately that it's been hard to get away. In fact, I'm leaving for New York in an hour and won't be back for a week. But things should slow down next month, so maybe I can get down there to see you then. I'd love to catch up with you and Colleen. Hey, is she around? I'd love to chat with her for a few minutes. Megan's response squeezed Mac's chest like a tight band, the realization of her words sinking in. He felt paralyzed, unable to speak. After a moment, Megan said, Mac, are you still there? Sorry, Megan. I dropped the phone. Listen, Colleen is out right now. I'll tell her to call you when she gets back. That would be great, Mac. And ask her to check her calendar for next month, Megan said. The two exchanged farewells, and once Mac hung up, he could only sit there in shock. Colleen had lied to him. She couldn't be spending the weekend with her sister because her sister was leaving town. Carter Harrison's mocking confession came back to him, and Mac now felt certain he knew where his wife was really headed. In that moment, Mac experienced the same agony he felt the day he watched Rico lying in the street, waiting to die. Once again, the most important person in his world was being taken from him. I can't stand it, he cried in anguish. It wasn't just Colleen's love he was losing, he realized despairingly, but also her strength. When he returned stateside after the war, he had felt completely lost. Colleen had come into his life and become his rock. She'd lent him her strength so he could begin to heal, and she continued to be strong for him throughout their marriage. Now all that was gone. His pain was unbearable. After a while, his grief and pain began to turn to anger. How could she do this to me? He thought bitterly. I tried to be a good husband. What did she want from me? She always said she loved me and loved being married to me. How could she turn around and betray me like this? His thoughts turned to Carter Harrison's so-called confessions, and his anger turned to rage. That little pig has been using Colleen to humiliate me. He wanted me to know what he was doing yet be helpless to say anything. Why does he hate me so much? What did I ever do to him? Then he realized that Harrison couldn't have done anything without Colleen's involvement. How did he get to her? Did he seduce her or drug her? Could he have blackmailed her somehow? A truly sickening thought hit him. Was she the one who started the affair? Did she come onto him? At that, his stomach lurched, and he barely made it to the bathroom before he was violently ill. Strangely, losing his breakfast helped Mac think more clearly. First, regardless of how it had happened, it now seemed clear that Colleen had betrayed him. Not only was she cheating on him this weekend, but if Harrison's confessions had any truth, this was actually the third time she had done so. When Mac recalled his wife's behavior over the last couple of weeks, he was inclined to believe it. Second, Mac now saw that whatever motivated Carter Harrison to taunt him went far beyond lust. If Harrison had merely wanted to commit adultery with Colleen, he wouldn't have confessed it. For whatever reason, Harrison seemed to have declared war on Mac. What was worse, by confessing his sins, Harrison had put Mac at a strategic disadvantage. Colleen's behavior was suspicious, but the fact that she lied about visiting her sister wasn't proof of her infidelity. It had only been Harrison's confessions that led him to this conclusion. Yet Mac was reluctant to reveal what Harrison had told him to anyone else. The confession might have been a joke to Carter, but it's real to me, Mac thought. If I tell someone, I'm breaking my oath to God. But it wasn't a true confession. Harrison felt no remorse. He wasn't seeking absolution. Why should I have to keep silent? Still, the thought of breaching the shield of the confessional deeply troubles me. Do I have the right to decide whether a confession is valid or not? Does motive make a difference, or am I rationalizing simply because I don't like what he told me? Other priests have kept confessions of terrible crimes confidential. How can I justify breaking my vow just because his confession involves my wife? Unable to solve the dilemma, Mac decided to do some detective work. There was no way he could hire a real detective on a priest's salary, but there was one other way he could try to check on Colleen. He had little doubt about what he would find, but he felt he owed it to his wife to try. He went online and quickly found a list of resort hotels at the beach. There were quite a few, but on a hunch, Mac searched based on room rates and then called the most expensive one. When the operator at the Royal Sands answered, Mac asked if Mr. and Mrs. Carter Harrison had checked in yet. After a moment, the operator confirmed that they had indeed arrived and asked if Mac wanted to be connected to their room. He hesitated, wondering if he should ask for Colleen and try to persuade her to come home. But even if she agreed, Mac realized that her presence there meant it was too late. "No," he said in a defeated voice, "there's no need." He slumped back in his chair, his last hope gone. As he sat there heartbroken, a new wave of shame hit him. He had forgotten to ask God for help. Quickly, he bowed his head and tried to pray, seeking divine guidance or at least consolation. In the past, his faith had provided meaning and direction in his life, but this time, he found no solace. The prayers he'd relied on so often now felt empty and meaningless. The tenets of the church seemed hollow and pointless. When he tried to recall some words from the Bible, the only text he could think of was the 22nd Psalm, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The failure seemed like a final blow to him. What kind of priest am I if God has abandoned me? He asked himself in despair. I've truly lost everything, my wife, my marriage, and now my faith. In the depths of his sorrow, Mac's thoughts turned back to what happened after Rico died. After Rico's killing, Mac withdrew from everyone, and his friends in the squad were deeply concerned about him. He began to spend every spare moment trying to solve the riddle of how the enemy sniper had killed so effectively without being spotted or heard. Allied intelligence believed the sniper was mobile, firing from a new location each time, but Mac wasn't so sure. He knew that every time a sniper moved, the likelihood of being spotted increased, yet no one had seen even a glimpse of the shooter. Mac obtained a map of the city and plotted the location of every casualty. He then dressed in a robe and kufi and walked through those neighborhoods, looking for likely vantage points. It took him 2 weeks before he realized that there was only one location providing perfect firing lines and excellent cover, the minaret that rose above one of the main mosques in the city. Mosques were off limits to the Allies. Command didn't want to provoke a response, so Mac had to prepare his ambush in secret. He also had to decide how best to draw out his opponent. The answer he came up with was simple: use himself as bait. He set up in the same position where he had been stationed when Rico was shot, and set up a second position nearby, this one with a clear firing line to the minaret. On the afternoon Mac was finally ready. He brought along his other sniper rifle, the M40, plus a spare uniform and helmet. He stuffed the uniform with old newspapers and lashed the helmet and rifle to it. Then he ran to his new position in such a way that he could pull the decoy to draw it out from cover. Grimly, he took his own position a few feet away and hunkered down to wait. When his watch told him it was almost time for afternoon prayers, he slowly tugged on the line to his decoy until it was just barely visible around the chimney where it was hiding. Then he aimed carefully at the gallery of the minaret, where he expected to find the Iraqi sniper. As the recorded sound of the call to prayer began to play, Mac's eye caught the barrel of a sniper rifle protruding through the arch in the gallery at the top of the minaret. The shooter never revealed himself, but Mac didn't care. He adjusted his aim to the spot on the masonry wall where he knew the sniper's head had to be and pulled the trigger. The barrel bucked against his shoulder, and a moment later, he saw an explosion of brick and mortar as the huge .50 caliber slug smashed through the wall. As Mac watched, the rifle slipped over the edge of the parapet and tumbled to the ground. Better make sure, Mac said to no one and fired again. He continued to fire at every part of the gallery until he had expended the entire 10-round clip. Then he pulled out another clip and began methodically firing again. He was on his third clip when one of his squad mates reached him and took the rifle away. When they went to check the mosque, the entire parapet on the minaret had been destroyed. They found the sniper's body in pieces. Command wasn't pleased with him, but there was no denying that Mac had eliminated a major threat. In one of those ironies the military is so good at, they sent him home due to post-traumatic stress disorder but awarded him the Expert Rifleman Medal. As he sat there lost in the memory, a surge of adrenaline coursed through him. I dealt with the problem then, so I can do it again. I may not be a good husband, and I know I'm not a good priest, but I do know how to handle my enemies, he thought to himself. That's enough for now. Energized, Mac went up into the attic and uncovered the black nylon carrying case he had long stowed away. He brought it downstairs and pulled out the Barrett with the high-powered scope. He wasn't supposed to have it, of course, but he had managed to smuggle it out of Iraq amidst the chaos of the conflict. Mac hadn't fired it since Baghdad, but now, as he hefted the heavy weapon, it felt like he was reunited with an old friend. Carefully, he cleaned and oiled the weapon, then put it back in the carrying case and left it in the bedroom where he could access it quickly. More than one parishioner at St. Anne's that Sunday noticed a change in Father Mac's demeanor. Their priest, normally positive and engaging, was stern even for him. When he led the congregation in the general confession, he slowed the recitation for emphasis. We have done those things that we ought not to have done, and we have left undone those things which we ought to have done. And there is no health in us, he intoned. For his sermon, he chose the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the story of how Lot's wife was turned into a pillar of salt. More than one parishioner exchanged questioning glances, surprised at the dark tone from the pulpit. Usually, after the service ended, congregants would stop to chat with Father Mac, but today most hurried on out. His expression and icy demeanor were not inviting. Preston Charlton approached him anyway. "Is everything okay, Father Mac?" he asked, gripping the priest's arm. "Everything's fine," Father Mac responded. "You just don't seem like your usual self," Preston said. "Thank you for your concern, Preston, but I'm fine," the priest insisted. "Where's Colleen?" "We missed her today." She went to visit her sister this weekend," Father Mac said. "I expect her back tomorrow." "Okay," the banker said, but it was clear to him that everything was not okay. He started to leave but then turned back and said quietly, "If you want to talk about anything, Father Mac, let me know. Just give me a call anytime." Then he moved on, a look of concern on his face. Father Mac went back inside to change out of his robes, intending to go straight home. But as he passed the reception desk, the phone rang and he instinctively answered. An oddly familiar female voice asked for him. "This is Father Mac. What can I do for you?" Hesitantly, the woman said, "This is Marge Terrell from the United Fund. Is there any chance I could come see you this afternoon?" The last thing Mac wanted at that point was a visitor, but his sense of duty prevailed, and he made arrangements to meet with Marge at 3 p.m. The woman wouldn't tell him what she wanted over the phone, but Mac could tell from her voice that she was upset. He didn't know her very well, but she had always been friendly when he'd seen her at the United Fund, and he felt an obligation to see her. Father Mac was waiting in front of the church when the gray-haired woman drove up, and he escorted her back to his office. Once inside and comfortably seated, the priest smiled at her encouragingly and asked, "How can I help you, Marge?" The woman looked as if she were about to cry. "It's my work, Father Mac. Some things have been happening at the United Fund that really bother me. I wanted to talk to Bill Allen, but he's on vacation and I don't know when he'll be back. Then something made me think of you, and that's when I called. Will you look at these and tell me what you think?" With that, she reached into her oversized purse, pulled out a sheaf of papers, and handed them to the priest. "See, this is what I'm talking about," she said, pointing at one of the documents. That afternoon, Father Mac made his regular rounds at the local retirement home, visiting with several elderly parishioners. Afterwards, he returned to his office and continued to study the copies he had made of the documents Marge had brought, trying to interpret what he was seeing. At that moment, his cell phone went off, and when he checked, he saw he had a text from Colleen, having a great time with Megan. Staying over till Monday morning. See you then. Love you. It was all Mac could do not to smash his phone against the wall in anger. He got up and left his office, locking the door to the church behind him. He drove to the office park where the United Fund was located, parked his car, and began walking along the now quiet streets. Occasionally, he stopped and made some notes. Finally, he left and returned home. On Monday morning, Colleen was late getting started on her drive back from the beach. She hadn't gotten any sleep until very late on Sunday night and now was going to be late to work. Additionally, the drive was uncomfortable because her backside was sore. At least I won't fall asleep behind the wheel, she thought as she shifted in her seat again. When she arrived at the hotel on Saturday, Carter had told her to check in as Mrs. Harrison. The desk clerk had a key card waiting for her, and Colleen was not surprised when he told her it was for the penthouse suite. Carter sure likes to travel in style, she thought to herself. The thought of what might be about to happen sent a twinge of anticipation through her as she entered the penthouse. Carter was waiting for her impatiently. No sooner had the door swung closed behind her than Carter asked her to change into something more comfortable. As she hurried to comply, she noticed an open suitcase on the bed filled with unusual items, which sent a mix of nervousness and anticipation through her. From that point on, everything became a blur. She remembered playful teasing and being gently restrained, exploring new boundaries in their interaction. Carter seemed to have an endless supply of energy, pushing the limits of what she thought was possible. Despite the intensity of the experience, she found herself enjoying every moment. At one point, they were lying in bed when there was a loud knock on the door. Carter, dressed only in his boxers, answered to find the hotel management checking to ensure that Mrs. Harrison was all right. Colleen was mortified when Carter insisted she answer the door holding only a towel in front of her, to prove that no crime had occurred. She felt even more humiliated when Carter dismissed her and she had to walk back into the bedroom, her rear exposed to the assistant manager. The man finally left, but not before advising them to keep the noise down to avoid disturbing other guests. Carter then proceeded to order room service for dinner. When the bellboy arrived with the cart, Carter insisted that he wheel it into the bedroom. Colleen, who had been in the bathroom, scrambled to get into bed and pull the sheets over her nakedness while the young man laid out their food with a barely concealed smirk. A similar scene occurred when Carter called for the plates to be removed. When Colleen woke on Sunday, she glanced at the clock and realized she was late for church. She felt a jolt of guilt but brushed it aside. After lunch, Carter informed her that they would be spending the afternoon at the beach. Colleen blushed when she saw the swimsuit he handed her. It was a thin white one-piece, with all modesty inserts removed, and was a size too small. It clung to her body like a second skin and would become transparent when wet. They spent the rest of the afternoon on the beach, alternating between sunbathing and walking by the ocean. It was hard to tell if Colleen was blushing or simply sunburned, as she remained a constant shade of red under the stares she provoked. The men's eyes scrutinized her every detail, while many women glared at her revealing outfit. Several mothers hurried their children away when they caught them staring. Carter reveled in the attention and made her walk slightly in front of him to ensure everyone got the best view. After returning to their suite and cleaning up, Carter surprised her by taking her to dinner at the hotel's upscale dining room. The good food, expensive wine, and after-dinner liqueur put Colleen in a mellow mood, and she looked forward to showing her gratitude when they returned to their room. However, as soon as the door clicked shut, Carter grabbed her and they resumed their intense physical interaction. After Carter had left, Colleen quickly packed her belongings and, after a brief attempt to tidy her appearance, headed for the lobby. Fortunately, Carter had already settled the bill. When she turned in the room key, she had to endure the desk clerk's stare as he wished her a good day. She realized with a pang of embarrassment that she wasn't wearing any underwear. "I can't go to work like this," she thought frantically. She sped to a nearby Walmart, ran through the aisles, and picked up a utilitarian white bra and a 3-pack of panties. After purchasing them, she hurried back to her car, tore open the packaging, and put on the underwear as modestly as she could while sitting in the front seat of her car. A teenage boy nearby gaped at her, but she tried to ignore him as she finished and then drove out of the parking lot, heading toward the highway. As she drove, a wave of guilt settled over her. The past weekend seemed like a feverish dream. Had she really deceived her husband to engage in such behavior with a lover? Had she really participated in 2 days of such activities? It all felt so unreal to her now. What she wanted was the love, security, and normalcy of her marriage. Tears welled up in her eyes as she thought about Mac waiting for her. If he were ever to find out the things she had done that weekend, she would be so ashamed she didn't think she could stand it. The thought of how it might affect him frightened her. "I'm going to be so good to him," she promised herself. "I'll never see Carter again." But even the mention of his name made her recall some of the experiences from the weekend, and she shivered involuntarily at the memory of his promise to bring others with him next time. "What's wrong with me?" she wondered. "I love my husband. I want to be a good wife and partner. So why does part of me want to act in ways that are so contrary to that? Why can't I control it? When did I become so conflicted?" Her helplessness made her angry. "It's all Carter's fault," she told herself. "He's the one who tempted me. He's the one who made me do things I now regret." But even as she blamed him, she had to admit that she was equally responsible. "He didn't drug me. He didn't force me," she conceded. "I could have walked out of that room at any time, but I didn't. I wanted what he was offering." As she drove through the outskirts of the city, she tried to push these thoughts away. "I need to go straight to the office and handle things there. I'll figure out what to do about everything else later." When she finally arrived at the women's shelter, things were chaotic. She quickly found herself buried in paperwork and phone calls until well past lunchtime. As she bit into a sandwich at her desk, she suddenly realized she hadn't called Mac. She quickly dialed the church office and reached Mrs. Moore. "Oh, hello Colleen, dear," Mrs. Moore said. "Father Mac said you might be calling." "No, he's not here right now. He's off at some meeting. I'm not sure when he'll be back." "Oh, but he did leave a message for you. He asked me to tell you that he has to make a hospital visitation tonight and that if it runs too late, he might stay there overnight." "No, there wasn't any other message." "Yes, I'll be sure to let him know you called." Colleen hung up the phone, lost in thought. Her sandwich lay forgotten. She desperately wanted to reconnect with her husband and was frustrated that they might not be reunited until the next day. Although she wasn't surprised by Mrs. Moore's message, given that Mac had spent the night at the hospital before, she still felt uneasy. "Is he avoiding me?" she wondered. "Is he upset because I didn't come back on Sunday?" She tried to suppress the thought that he might know about her weekend. That possibility was too dreadful to consider. When she got home late from work, she hoped Mac would be there, but the house was dark and his car was missing. At least with Mac gone, she thought, she could unpack her suitcase without worrying about him seeing anything. She ran a load of laundry and then decided to take a shower. The quick sponge bath she had taken before leaving the hotel had left her feeling unclean all day. As she emerged from the bathroom and began changing into comfortable clothes, she noticed a long black bag in the corner of the bedroom. Curiously, she walked over to examine it, but when she felt the heavy-duty nylon, she realized what it contained and quickly withdrew her hand as though she had touched something dangerous. It was Mac's old rifle, which he had kept stored away in the attic ever since they moved into the parish house. Why would he have it out now, she wondered. The sight of it brought back memories of the dark days following Mac's return from Iraq, days she had hoped were long behind them. The presence of the rifle made her feel very uneasy. Nervously, she tried calling Mac's cell phone but only reached a recording that he was unavailable. She remembered that he always turned his phone off when at the hospital, which didn't reassure her. Torn between anxiety and guilt, Colleen found it difficult to sleep despite her exhaustion. The next morning, Father Mac arrived at his desk early and found a note from Mrs. Moore about Colleen's call. He looked at it grimly and then set it aside. There would be time for that later. At that moment, there was a timid knock on the door frame. When he looked up, he was surprised to see Marge Carroll standing there. "I'm sorry to intrude, Father Mac, but another document came in yesterday afternoon, and I thought you might need it as well," she said, handing him a stack of papers. He reviewed them and felt a chill. He looked up to thank her, but she had already left. Father Mac picked up the phone and called Preston Charlton. "I have another document, Preston. I'd like to bring it by your office before your meeting." Preston's response prompted Father Mac to quickly close up his office and head for his car, his face set in grim determination. Meanwhile, Carter Harris was working at his desk when a call came in from the president of the Board of Trustees, requesting his presence at an urgent meeting at the bank. Carter felt annoyed by the unexpected summons but knew he couldn't refuse. "Who does Preston Charlton think he is?" Carter sneered as he got behind the wheel to drive to the bank. "I'm not just a servant at his beck and call." As he pulled into the bank's parking garage, he spotted Father Mac leaving, which amused him. He wouldn't be so self-righteous if he knew what happened last weekend, Carter chuckled to himself. After parking his car, Harrison got in the elevator and rode to the executive suite, where a secretary led him into Preston Charlton's office. Summoning his most pleasant demeanor, Carter approached Charlton's desk with his hand outstretched. "Preston, it's good to see you," he exclaimed. Charlton ignored the handshake and remained seated, a scowl on his face. "Harrison, I'll get straight to the point. I've just been on a teleconference with the other trustees. They voted unanimously to remove you as executive director of the United Fund, effective immediately." "What?" Harrison shouted. "What's this all about?" Charlton picked up a stack of papers from his desk. "I have here a set of expense reports you submitted for reimbursement over the past few months. They contain numerous unauthorized purchases of items for your personal use, inappropriate expenditures not permitted by United Fund policies, and expenses that clearly exceed spending limitations." "Let me see those," Harrison demanded. When Charlton handed them over, Harrison shuffled through them quickly, then angrily tore the sheets in half and threw them on the floor. "This is ridiculous," he exclaimed. "You want to fire me over trivial expenses? I've brought in more donations and increased revenues since I've been in charge. The United Fund is doing better than ever. I'm worth far more than what you're paying me. You can't seriously be concerned about a few expense items." Charlton's voice was filled with anger and contempt. "You don't understand, Carter. You don't have the right to decide what's acceptable and what's not. It's not your money, it's the donor's money. They didn't give it to the United Fund for you to dine at fancy restaurants or buy overpriced food and wine. They didn't donate their money for you to vacation at some resort and live extravagantly, as you did last weekend. And then you had the audacity to submit your personal outing for reimbursement under the guise of attending a conference. My secretary checked with the hotel this morning. There was no conference there last weekend. It's a high-pressure job," Harrison shot back. "I'm entitled to some rest and relaxation on the United Fund's dime. It's like investing, you have to spend money to make money. You, of all people, should understand that." His face darkened. "But it doesn't matter, you can't fire me. I have a contract, and if you try to break it, my attorney will sue you for damages and tie you up with restraining orders for years." Charlton acknowledged this coolly. "You could probably do that, but in the end, we'd still win. We'd also pursue civil and criminal charges against you. You'd be facing possible fines and jail time, not to mention ruinous legal fees. However, a fight like that would damage the reputation of the United Fund. That's why I've been authorized to offer you a deal. If you sign a document admitting to misuse of funds and agree to make restitution, we'll allow you to resign quietly and agree not to press charges. He held up a legal document and handed it to Harrison. Here's the agreement, Harrison. I'd advise you to sign it. It's the best deal you can get. Harrison grabbed the document angrily and tucked it into his coat jacket. I'll take this to my attorney. He'll have a good laugh out of it, he snapped. But Charlton wasn't finished. I still can't believe you're so upset about my expense account. There's got to be more to it than that. Then his expression changed. It's that priest, isn't it? I saw McClanahan leaving just before I arrived. This is all just a smokescreen to protect his saintly reputation. He told you about my confession, didn't he? And now you're trying to get back at me. Charlton looked at him in confusion. I don't know what you're talking about, Harrison. Harrison, now almost giddy with excitement, continued, I can't believe it. Father McClanahan broke his vows. He told you about my confession. I'll have him defrocked for this, and once the secret is out, everyone will know I confessed to him. He'll become the laughing stock of the town. After I'm done with him, he won't be able to look anyone in the eye. What confession? Charlton asked. Father Mac was here, but he never mentioned any confession. Don't give me that. Harrison spat. I went to him and confessed to having an affair. I didn't tell him who it was with, but I kept hinting at it. He swore he'd keep my confession secret, but when he realized it was his own wife I was involved with, he broke his vows and told you. Charlton stood up in astonishment. You did what? You're lying, Harrison. Colleen would never cheat on Mac. Harrison sneered. You don't know the real Colleen O'Reilly. Who do you think I took to the beach last weekend? You should have heard her begging for more when I was with her, Carter bragged. Charlton's face turned pale, and his voice took on an urgent tone. If you're telling the truth, my advice is to sign that document and leave town immediately. Get as far away from here as fast as you can. You need to understand, Mac was in the Marines. He served in the Iraq War. That's a joke, Harrison snarled. He doesn't scare me. What's he going to do, throw his Bible at me? He's no pushover, Charlton said urgently. He's one of the toughest men I know, and he loves his wife more than anything. The Iraqi Republican Guards used to call him the Zala Almont, the shadow of death. Harrison interrupted him. I've heard enough about your so-called hero priest. I'm not afraid of him, and I'm not afraid of your board of trustees. You'll be hearing from my attorney. With that, he stormed out of Charlton's office, slamming the door behind him. Preston slumped back in his chair for a moment, then grabbed his phone and tried to call Father Mac's cell. When he got a recording, he tried St. Anne's, but Mrs. Moore hadn't seen the priest. Preston thanked her and hung up. Don't do anything stupid, Mac. Please don't do it, he kept repeating to himself. Colleen was working at her computer when Carter Harrison barged into her office, his face flushed with anger. He broke his vows, he shouted. Your saintly husband broke his vows. Colleen noticed people peering uneasily into her office and tried to quiet the angry man pacing in front of her desk. Calm down, Carter. Lower your voice and tell me what happened. What happened is that your Episcopal priest husband broke the seal of confession. He told Preston Charlton all about my confession, Carter raged. I'm going to have him excommunicated. Just wait and see what people think of him. Wait a minute. Why did you make a confession, Carter? You don't go to church. Why would you go to confession? Colleen asked in confusion. Harrison scowled at her. Because I wanted to show that self-righteous jerk his place. Everybody thinks he's so wise and good, but he's not half as smart as I am. Now everyone will know it." He laughed out loud. It was beautiful. I laughed in his face the whole time, and he didn't even realize it. I told him what I had done, and there was nothing he could do about it. "Oh God, Carter, what did you tell him? Please say you didn't tell him about us." Outside, Colleen's coworkers gasped, but in her panic, she focused solely on Harrison. He smirked at her. "Oh, but I did. I told him I was committing adultery with a woman he knew. I even told him I was taking her to the beach last weekend for some fun and games. I made sure he'd figure it out, and all the while, I was laughing at him. I made him a fool. Now that he's broken his vows, I'm going to ruin him. Oh my God, what have you done? He'll kill you." "Oh, sure, I'm supposed to be afraid of some Marine Corps chaplain," Carter retorted. "He wasn't a chaplain, Carter. He was a sniper, a trained killer. He had over 50 confirmed kills in Iraq. He once shot a man from over a mile and a half away. They called him the Shadow of Death, Zala Almond," she said frantically. "I don't believe you. You're just making that up. Believe what you want, but he's no super soldier." "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Colleen said. When his best friend in Iraq was killed, Max spent weeks tracking down the enemy sniper before he took him out. They only found bits and pieces of that man. That's why he brought that rifle down. He still has it, and it's huge. He once told me it could shoot a bullet through a brick wall and still kill the person behind it. As Harrison looked at her uncertainly, Colleen pleaded with him. "Carter, please, you have to go. You have to get out of town now. It's your only chance." The man eyed her suspiciously. "Why are you so anxious for me to run?" "Sure, you like the things I did last weekend, but I know you don't care about me. Why do you care what happens?" Tears began to well in her eyes. "You're right, Carter. I couldn't care less about what happens to you, but I care deeply about what happens to Mac. The last time he lost someone he truly loved, it nearly destroyed him. I don't want that to happen again. He doesn't deserve that." Harrison's uncertainty grew. He started to speak twice, but stopped himself. He looked around at the people outside Colleen's office and then back at her. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. "You're crazy," he said. "And this is all nonsense. All I know," he continued, "is that Father McClanahan has shown his true colors, and I'm going to let the whole world know." With that, he stomped out of her office and headed for his car. As he drove back to the United Fund, his thoughts were a jumble. He was elated at having outsmarted McClanahan, yet angry that the priest had disclosed his confession. He wanted the man punished for breaking his vows, but now that the secret was out, he was eager for everyone to know how he'd outwitted his antagonist. Yet, even as his mind raced with excitement, he found himself scanning the sidewalks as he drove, wondering if McClanahan might be watching him even now. He tried to shake off his growing uneasiness, but it clung to him like an unwelcome shadow. When he arrived at the United Fund building, he noticed several employees gathered in the parking lot and more clustered in the lobby. Harrison ignored them and pushed his way through. As he reached his office, he found the door wide open, even though he was sure he had closed it before leaving. Peering inside, he gasped. The room looked as though it had been ransacked. Dust filled the air, and papers were scattered everywhere. His desk was damaged, and his executive chair was overturned. When he set it upright, he saw a large ragged hole punched through the back support. In shock, he looked around and saw sunlight streaming through a shattered cinder block wall behind his desk. As he stood there in stunned disbelief, the receptionist approached nervously. "Excuse me, Mr. Harrison. Father Mac came by this morning and left a package for you. He asked me to make sure you got it right away, saying it was urgent." Harrison took the package from her and opened it cautiously. Inside, he found a pointed cylinder over 5 inches long. At first, he didn't recognize it, but then he realized he was holding an unusually large bullet. Numbly, he hefted it, noting its weight. Could this really be a shell for a rifle? With a shudder, he quickly shoved it back into the package. As he did, he noticed a sheet of paper inside. Gingerly, he fished it out and examined it. It was a page torn from the Bible, from the book of Exodus. A few words had been highlighted, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. As Harrison stared at the text, he remembered something McClanahan had told him, how he had killed a man from over 1.5 miles away. Abruptly, he spun around to stare out the window at the nearby office buildings. McClanahan could be on top of any one of them right now, Harrison thought, and fear ran through him like ice water. Instinctively, he stepped away from the window, putting the cinder block wall between him and the outside world. He glanced at the hole in the wall and, in a panic, dropped to the floor on his hands and knees. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the document Charlton had given him, hastily signing it and leaving it on the dusty carpet. Then he scurried out of his office and rushed for the exit. As he ran to his car, he shouted at the employees milling around, "I signed it. Tell him not to shoot, I signed it." He gunned the engine and sped away, heading for the interstate. After Harrison had left, Colleen sat down at her desk in shock, drying her eyes and trying to compose herself. After a few minutes, she stood up, grabbed her purse, and walked out of her office. "I'm leaving," she told one of her coworkers. "Will you be back?" the woman asked uncertainly. Colleen glanced at her bleakly. "I doubt it," she said. Once she got to her car, Colleen drove quickly to St. Anne's, hoping to find her husband. When she arrived, she hurried to Max's small office, but it was empty. Mrs. Moore, alarmed by Colleen's appearance, followed her. "Where is he?" Colleen demanded. The poor woman had no idea. "I think he was here early this morning, but I haven't seen him since." Colleen glanced around Max's office and then turned to leave. "If you hear from him, have him call me immediately," she yelled over her shoulder. "And tell him not to do anything." As she got behind the wheel of her car, Colleen burst into tears. Now that the adrenaline was wearing off, she felt a growing sense of despair. Like a frightened child, she wished she could wake up and find that all this had been just a nightmare. After a moment, she started the car and headed for home, hoping to find Max there. Her hopes were dashed when she found the driveway empty. Deeply depressed, she parked her car and went inside. When she caught a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror, she went back to the bathroom to splash cold water on her red, swollen eyes. As she came out, she noticed, to her horror, that the gun bag she had seen in the bedroom that morning was now missing. She sank onto the bed and began to weep again. "What have I done? What have I done? I don't care what happens to me, but if I've turned Max back into a killer, I'll never forgive myself." She sat in the darkened bedroom for a long time before she heard the sound of a car in the driveway. Slowly, she got up and walked into the living room to wait. When Max came through the front door, the heavy rifle was slung over his shoulder. She looked at him fearfully as he stood there in silence. When she couldn't stand it any longer, she whispered, "Did you kill him?" "I was planning to," he said, "but I finally realized that it wasn't worth it. So I settled for frightening him half to death. I guess it worked. Preston called me just a little while ago from the United Fund office." The employees told him Harrison drove away in a panic. They found his signed resignation and confession in his office. "I don't think anyone will have to worry about Carter Harrison anymore." Colleen slowly sank to her knees, momentarily overcome by relief, but then she looked up at Max with renewed fear in her eyes. "Are you going to hurt me?" she asked hastily. Max unslung his rifle and set it aside. "No, Colleen, you're not worth me spending time in jail," he said. "Not even after what I did." Carter told me he confessed everything to you. Max shook his head sternly. You know I can never reveal anything said in confession, but I found out what you did on my own. The way you were acting the last few weeks made me suspicious. When I called Megan after you left on Saturday, I found out you'd lied to me about your plans. I guessed and called the Royal Sands. They told me Mr. and Mrs. Harrison had checked in later. Carter's expense account confirmed you was there, and this morning when I came by the house, I found the complimentary comb from the hotel. So I know you were there too. Now, Colleen bowed her head in shame. I'm sorry, Max. So very sorry. You don't even know the half of it. It's so much worse than just cheating on you. I did terrible things with him and let him do worse things to me. I'm so ashamed. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. I wish you would end it. I deserve to suffer. The pain in his voice was palpable. Why, Colleen? Why would you do this? What did I do wrong? She began to sob. Oh, Max, don't ever think any of this was your fault. Somehow, Carter saw a side of me I didn't know I had. He dominated me and used me, and I loved it. It was like a drug. Once I tried it, I was hooked. She looked at him with pleading eyes. I've seen many alcoholics and drug addicts in my work, and I was exactly like them. All I wanted was another fix, regardless of who might be hurt. He knelt beside her. I know something about temptation, Colleen. I've had my share, especially the last few days, he said quietly. She dared to look at him. Do you think you could ever love me again, Max, even after all I've done? He took her arms and lifted her to her feet. I will always love you, Colleen. She threw her arms around him, hugging him as though she were clinging to the mast of a ship in a storm. After a while, she pulled back, looking at him with new hope in her eyes. Can you find it in your heart to forgive me? I know I've hurt you so terribly, but if you'll give me the chance, I'll be the best wife you could ever hope for. I'll spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of your love. Please, Max, please forgive me. He looked at her solemnly. I do forgive you, Colleen. She embraced him again, but when she realized he wasn't returning her embrace, she drew back. What is it, Max? He looked into her eyes, his voice filled with pain. I'll always love you, Colleen, but I can't stay married to you. But why? She protested. You said you forgave me. I do forgive you, Colleen, but I can never forget what you've done. I've lost my faith in you. As he spoke, her tears returned harder than before. That was the thing about Rico, he said. That's why it was so bad when he was killed. I always knew I could count on him. His face twisted in pain as the memory flashed before him. Even when he was lying on that street, waiting for the second bullet, he was thinking about me. He looked at his wife with a despairing expression. Before all this happened, you were my strength, Colleen. When I needed you, I always felt I could count on you. But now, I can never be sure that you'll be there. I have no choice but to learn to live without you now. She fell to the floor again, but this time, he let her lie there. When Preston Charlton walked into the church office the next day, Max was busy pulling papers out of files. Preston watched him for a moment and then asked quietly, "How did it go with Colleen?" Max looked up with a tortured expression on his face. "She's driving up to her sister's house today. I think she's planning on staying with her until she can find a place of her own." "I'm really sorry, Max," the banker said. "I would never have believed things would turn out this way." Max looked away to hide the pain in his eyes and resumed pulling items out of the files. "What are you doing?" Preston asked. Max turned to face his friend. "I'm leaving St. Anne's, Preston. I'm going to quit the priesthood." Charlton looked at Max in shock. "You can't do that. People here need you." Max shook his head stubbornly. They need somebody better than me. I wasn't a very good husband, and for sure, I wasn't a very good priest. I couldn't protect Colleen from Carter Harrison, and I didn't help the United Fund when I saw the warning signs. Max, you can't hold yourself responsible for what happened. Harrison had us all fooled, me most of all. And as for temptation, well, all of us are tempted at one time or another and have to deal with it when it comes. I don't understand what happened with Colleen, but if I remember my Sunday school lessons correctly, she wasn't the first person who yielded to temptation. Max smiled sadly. Maybe so, Preston, but I still feel like I should have done something. His face resumed its somber look. But even setting Ken aside, there's no denying that I came very close to harming a man this week. I definitely threatened him and damaged the United Fund office in the process. What kind of a priest does that? Preston smiled. For goodness sake, don't worry about the building. Considering that you got Harrison to sign that confession and resignation, it was well worth it. To be honest, I think the board wants to give you a medal for getting rid of Harrison, not a bill for property damage. Then his face took on a more serious expression. As for threatening Harrison, I really don't think God or anyone else could blame you for getting so angry at that man after the way he went after you. God, Max said bitterly, that's the worst part of all. I think God has abandoned me, and I've lost my faith in him. When I realized what was going on with Colleen, I tried to turn to him for help or at least consolation, but I got nothing. Where was he when I really needed him? He picked up some notes lying on his desk and showed them to Charlton. Here's my sermon on Sodom and Gomorrah from last Sunday. Remember how God sent an angel to Lot to lead him to safety before the two cities were destroyed? Where was my angel? Why didn't God send somebody to save me? In a defeated voice, Max whispered, I came so close to harming that man, Preston. If some woman I hardly knew hadn't come to my office with those expense accounts, I would have acted on my anger. Charlton gave him a puzzled look. What did you just say, Father? Max looked at him uncertainly. I said I would have harmed Carter Harrison if Marge Terrell hadn't shown up out of the blue. He stopped abruptly, thinking about what he had just said. A look of wonder came over him. After a long moment, he began to put his files back in his desk. I guess maybe this is where I belong after all, he said quietly. God works in mysterious ways, and sometimes angels walk the earth. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.